And okay, yeah, just as mentioned before, and the individual work, the next individual work is due next week, which is week 15. So we will not have any lectures or labs then. And for questions, just email me. And we still have one more lecture this week to cover the last part. And it's mostly about hosting Heroku, which is hosting your Express and Express server online, so it will be run online, and a little bit more fetch in terms of front end, how to get access to the data. We're going to cover those. But for this lab, I really just want to go through the requirements for the coursework to individual work. And so the details are in the module handbook, which I assume you all know where to find it by now. And the module book has been updated after the new year. So it's just to include more details about the coursework to individual work. So if you download the module handbook, and before, so sometime last year, it's useful to just re-download it again or check the latest version on the module page.
How much is it changed? Sorry. How much is it changed?
And I can't remember what the old version is. And so,
Did the criteria stay the same, or
sorry?
the markings stay the same, or no?
No, I don't think the marking scheme is the same. I think it's changed. I think it's probably easier for me to include opening from the Acrobat Reader. Okay, and the other thing I also want to mention is I noticed some students might just only following the marking scheme and on the submission page, which is okay, but in that sense you miss some other information as well. So I would recommend and check the module handbook, use all the information there. So let me change to a student. So if you go to the submission page now and coursework to individual work, and you would see marking scheme like this. And so that's definitely correct. But there's some other information which is not here. And for example, and for the first individual work, and there's a requirement to say you have to host your page or your front end on GitHub Pages. And if you fail that, you will not get any mark for the coursework. And that kind of requirements will not be listed in the marking scheme because it's not associated with any mark. But if you fail that, you really should get 0 mark for the work. So that's actually more serious than, say, losing a couple of marks. So it has been quite relaxed for the first coursework, but for this one, I'll try to follow the requirements.
So what was it? If you get 0 marks if your work is, what was it?
No, all the details will be on the module handbook. So use the module handbook.
So I got a good question. I'm studying 4 modules, and I have 3 of them didn't choose to change the module handbook specs, but you choose to change everything or change the handbook. I've never seen that, or I've never heard any university does that. What was the main reason for that?
I already mentioned at the beginning of the module. I said this module is a new one. Things will be updated. So what you saw at the beginning of the year was what was used last year. This year we'll be making changes, depends on the feedback we could get from last year.
Okay, because I was just wondering that the other teachers haven't changed them.
Tell us at any minute order.
Sorry?
Cool. If you can't join from your laptop, join from your phone or net. Cool. Yeah, cool. Shout Ace as well.
Okay. So the main idea of the second work is to build the backend. For the first front end you build in the first coursework, and most of the work will be on the back end. And so you need to create both the server, which is Express, and then database, which will be the MongoDB. And the MongoDB needs to be online, which will be MongoDB Atlas. And the server also needs to be online. In this case, we'll be using Heroku, which we'll cover this week. Okay, and so these are the requirements that you have to meet. Otherwise, you will not get any mark for your work. And some of these are more obvious, and I just have to list it here, because otherwise students will come to me and say, you didn't say that in the requirements, so why can't I do that? Okay, that's the only reason. So some of these might appear very obvious. For example, the server must be using Node. You're not allowed using Apache or XAMPP or any other servers. Okay, and then data must be stored in MongoDB Atlas, which is the online version, which we covered in the lecture. You're not allowed to use local ones or different database altogether. Okay, and then in terms of accessing data, you must access through REST API. And in the sense, you're not allowed to access database directly. For example, you connect it to the database in the front-end code. That's not allowed. That's also a very bad practice in real world. And because you don't want people, because the front-end code is everybody can see, and you don't want to put, say, the username password of your database in the front-end code that everybody can see. And then, yeah, in terms of REST API, must be developed using Express. That's what we covered. And you're not allowed to use any other libraries. Okay, and then connected to MongoDB must use the native Node.js driver. Again, this is what we covered in the lecture. You're not allowed to use Mongoose or other libraries. And then the server itself needs to be hosted on Heroku, so make it online. And you're not allowed to use the local server. It is okay when you're first developing your backend, you can test it online. Test it locally on your laptop. But eventually, when you submit, it needs to be working online. And again, in terms of accessing data in the front end, so here the front end needs to retrieve the data. In the first coursework, the data you might stored in the JavaScript files or just stored hard-coded in your JavaScript file. Now you can't do that. You have to retrieve that, and it has to use fetch. Again, this is what we covered in the lecture. You're not allowed to use the XML HTTP request or libraries like Axios. And there's only a few fetches you need to do, and we have examples in the lecture already. Okay.
Sorry, Kai, could I ask a quick question, please?
Yeah,
Just,
sure.
So are we presenting next week, or are we submitting next week Friday, but presenting the weeks after, like before? Like we have to book an appointment or something?
Yeah, and so the individual work is due next Friday, so it's no presentation next week. And then demonstration is same as the coursework one individual work, in the sense we do this individually.
Right.
Yeah,
and
everyone book a slot.
So the presentation won't be next week, but it'll be in 2 weeks' time, basically, right?
That's right. Yeah, the actual demonstration will be the week after next.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Fair enough.
Okay, yeah, we'll talk about fetch. So just use fetch, don't use anything else. That's all it really is. And next one is, say, the code must be on GitHub repository and with at least 10 commits. And so this is how the Heroku gonna get the backend. So that's why you have to put it on GitHub repository, make your life a little bit easier. So you don't have to upload your changes every time you make some changes to your code. Only to the repository will be fine. And Heroku will automatically get the code changes from GitHub. We will cover that in the lecture. And also, this must be a new repository, and you're not allowed to use the same repository for the front end. Again, just the separation between the front and back end. So in the back end, the code is usually private, and where the front-end code is usually public, where the people can access all your code. Whereas the backend, you have all your, say, credentials like username, password. You don't want it to be on a public repository. That's why you put it in a separate one. And again, and you need to have 10 commits. I think that should be quite easy. I don't think any people had problems having 10 commits for the first coursework. Okay, and the last one is, say, it must be demonstrated. I think you would know this by now. All the coursework needs to be demonstrated, and you have to be able to explain and what the code does, just to make sure, say, either you use it from some examples you need to understand. You just don't just blindly copy and paste. Okay, so these are the requirements you have to meet, and it doesn't give you any extra marks, but if you fail them, you will not get any mark for the coursework.
Kai,
Yeah.
does the backend, the code which we are going to write it for the server, does it have to be on the GitHub as well? Like it is included in 10 commits?
Yes. So that's what this part is for. So you should make a new repository and
Okay.
for your backend code, and it should has 10 commits, and then separate from the repository from the front-end
Okay.
code.
As we are going to make changes in our front end as well, like when we are making requests to API, do we need to make commits for that code as well, for the front end code as well?
Yes, yeah.
That one will go in the first repository.
That's right.
Okay. Only
Yeah.
so for the second, for this coursework, we need to make just like commits for 10 commits are required just for the backend. And
Yes,
then
exactly. Yeah.
different repository. Okay, that's fine.
Yeah. Okay, I think that's actually quite a good point. So, as later on, as we go through the requirements, you will see you will still need to make changes to the front end, and the least will be you need to now to access or call the REST service API to get data or commit or upload the order details once it's submitted. So these are minimum changes, and you need to update the front end to include those. And also, if you want to make any other changes to the front end code, and that's also completely fine, you don't have to stick with what you had for the coursework one. If you want to add more features, make it looks better, or any other changes, that's completely fine. And there's no reason say how to stick with the version. For some students, say they don't have the submit order forms in the coursework one, for example, they didn't get time to finish that, and you will need that for this coursework. So you can add that still to the front end. Okay, and any other questions regarding these requirements? Okay, and so there's still be time to ask questions once we go through all the marking criteria. Okay, and the next part is about submission. And so even though all the code will be hosted online and in GitHub reports, GitHub pages or Mongo Atlas or and finally what the other one, Heroku, and you still need to submit the code and the data and also the URL to all these different online services. And the general guideline is just to put everything in one zip file, and that should not be more than 10 megabytes. That should be plenty because your submission should only just including some text files, some HTML, CSS, and some JSON files. And that's mostly it. Maybe a few JavaScript files as well. Maybe the largest thing you can include maybe is some just image files. That's all. But in total, it should not be more than 10 megabytes. And so first, you need to including the URLs to all your online services. So just put the URL in a text file. So the URL to your backend code, the GitHub repository for your backend code, and the URL to the GitHub pages, which runs your front end. So your demonstration really should be done on the GitHub pages, and it should talk to the backend, which is hosted on Heroku, which talk to the database, which is hosted on Mongodb Atlas. should be all running online. You don't need anything to run locally on your computer. And then finally, and the URL to the Heroku route. And so this is like the equivalent of localhost 3000/lessons. So this is the URL which you run when it's run the server locally, and when it's run Heroku, it will give you a different URL, and followed by the path you set in your route. So you need a text file including the URL to these tracings. Okay. And then the next part is you need to export the lesson and order collection in your MongoDB database. So these are the two things, minimum collections you need to create for your database, MongoDB. And we already talked about, you can just do this in Compass. And there's a link there shows you how to export collections from Compass. And it's quite straightforward. I'm not sure if you can see properly. The picture is slightly small. It doesn't increase the picture size. So, and this is slightly better now. Say in MongoDB Campus, you have select the collection you want to export, and then in this here, the option just to choose export collections, and that's it. That's all you need to do. And then after that, you can choose the things you want to include in collection. You probably want to include everything, and choose either JSON or CSV file format. Again, either is okay, and then just click export. Then they should give you either a JSON or CSV file of your collection, and just include that in the submission. Okay. Okay, and in terms of the backend code, so that's the server side, the Express server side, and do not including any node module files. And for example, you will need Express and MongoDB to run your server, but don't including these module files in the GitHub or the submission. And if you include, that's most likely going to exceed the 10 megabyte and file limit. So these are all you need to do is just to list all the required modules in the package.json, which can be easily installed otherwise. And it's the same. So don't include that in the GitHub or the submission file. Actually, sorry. And what this particular point means, it just says, and the actual code itself, the JavaScript files, you need to be included in the submission. And also including the front-end code, and you would have made changes to front-end code. For example, you can now fetch data from MongoDB or from the server. That's input. And finally, you need to export the request created in Postman. So later I'm going to go through the marking scheme. One of the criteria is to create request in Postman, so this is actually to make your life a bit easier when you're developing code. You can do the testing. Also, you can use that for demonstration. Again, in terms of exporting, it's quite straightforward. So that will be the interface that will be part of the Postman. That will be one of the collections, and you click these 3 dots, and there will be an export button, and that's all it is. And sorry, I think I got someone at the door. I'll be right back. Okay, and sorry about that. I'm back now. Yeah, and just in terms of the exporting, so you just go to Postman, click on the 3 dots for a collection. Here, the collection name is called Air Quality, and choose Export. And choose one of the formats. Doesn't really matter. I think so long as it's not the version 1, which is no longer recommended. and then choose which of these requests you want to. You probably want to include everything. And finally, just click download, which give you a JSON file, and then just include that JSON file inside your submission. Okay, I think so. There's quite a few things to include in the submission zip file. And is there any questions about what to include in the submission file? Okay, I mean the
Is it
general,
just,
yeah,
sorry,
Well?
is it just those 5 bullet points on the submission? So
yeah,
is it
yeah,
a text file that includes blah blah blah, and then the
yeah,
lesson and order collection? Okay, okay, yeah, that's fine, that's fine.
yeah. So basically, everything you needed for the backend needs to be included. So that included the include the actual code and the dump from the database and the URLs to different places where it's hosted. Okay, and now I'm going to go to the actual marking criteria. And the first one is about MongoDB, and you are required to create 2 collections in MongoDB, one for lesson and the other for order. And so I listed some minimum fields that you need for each of these collections. And for the lesson, you need at least and topic, price, location, and space. And these are exactly the same as before. And then in terms of the actual order itself, you need to have the name and the phone number. These are the information people enter in the form, and the lessons people ordered, and the number of space people ordered for that lesson. And this can get slightly more complicated in the sense, and one order might contain multiple lessons. For example, people booked 1 space for math and 2 space for English. So that can get slightly more complicated for this part. And for the actual collection, you can just create that in MongoDB campus just by clicking the buttons. You can click, say, create a new collection and add something there. That's all it is. Should be very straightforward to do. And so as I go through, I mean, if you have any questions, I think it's probably easier just stop me straight away and I can answer you there rather than have to go back later. You might forget about questions already. Okay, and the second part is about Node. Really, this is just about having your package.json file correctly set up. So it should including all the required modules. So I would expect you need at least the Express and MongoDB, these 2 modules. You might want to use some other modules, that's okay. But those 2 are probably the minimum I would expect. And also, if you didn't include the required modules or the dependency in the package.json, and I will not be able to run your backend because it tells me missing files, etc. And the other one is you to make sure have the correct start script. And so basically it tells Node what are the commands to run when you want to start the server. So basically, once this is set up, you can run npm start in the command line to no matter what the actual command would be, which will be including start script. This is also how the Heroku would run your server. If you didn't set this up, and your server will not be able to start properly on the Heroku. Okay, and finally is just to do not include the node module from the backend Git support. So basically, don't upload any files and the node modules to the GitHub repository. This can be quite easily done using git ignore. I think there's an example in the lecture. Okay. So next one is the middleware, and ask you to do 2 things to create 2 middleware. The first middleware is a logger, which just outputs the request to the server console. And this is probably the simplest possible and middleware. And again, we have examples in the lecture. All you need to do is just output the request string on the console using a console.log. That's all it is. Okay, and the next one is slightly more complicated in the sense, and you need to use serve static files. And again, we have examples in the lecture, and Express has certain functions to make this quite easy. So basically, if you enter a name like a lesson.jpg, and then it should return the JPG files that can be used for the front end to display the picture for the lessons. And if the picture does not exist, image does not exist, it should show an error message, say file not found or something. Okay, and then we come to the actual REST API. So this is the part where the front end can talk to, and then the backend would talk to the database. And the first part is you need to connect to MongoDB using the native Node.js driver. So you're not allowed to use Mongoose or other libraries to do this. Have to be native Node. So again,
Sorry, this was due not next week, but the week after, right?
It's due next week, but the presentation's in 2 weeks.
yeah. The deadline is next Friday.
Let me just note that down.
And if you just check the module page, and if you go to, it will show you on the module page, it says deadline. It's at least what looked like for me now. It says due 29th of January and 5 o'clock. If you click inside, it shows the actual deadline is 5 o'clock. Okay, and we get back to there. Yeah, so once you connect to the database, you need to create 3 routes. And the first one is to get all the lessons. So that should be a get route, which retrieve all the lessons from the database. And you need a post route, then saves a new order to the order collection. So this should happen when user click submit order button, and it should send a post request to the backend. Then the backend will save the order information into the database. And in terms of the actual information you need to save is mentioned here. These are the minimum fields that need to be saved inside each order.
Just another quick question. So you see how we can use our group work in this, right?
Yeah.
So how much does our group work cover in this case? It just covers the like a percent in the fetch area and a percent in like the database area, not database for MongoDB, but like
I think the group work covers some of the middleware, and it doesn't really cover any of these REST API part yet because we haven't covered the REST API part when we do the group work. And it's also did some of the fetch as well, but again, it didn't cover everything in terms of fetch.
Yeah, it was just get log post and stuff. Yeah,
exactly, because we haven't used database yet. Can't do. Okay. Yeah. Okay. And finally, a put route that updates the number of space in the lesson collection after an order is submitted. I think some students are slightly confused about this one. And so what this meant for is once a user or customer submit an order, for example, he booked 2 places for the math lesson, then the available space for the math class needs to be reduced permanently. For example, there was 10, now it needs to be reduced to 8. Okay, so that's what this part is for. So it should happen at the same time when the user submitted the order, and it should send another put request, which is to update the lesson collection, not the order collection, and more specifically the space. For example, if you have 2 math class space booked, then that needs to be reduced by 2 from whatever they already have. So that's what this put is for, and for update. Okay, and finally, you need to create at least 1 postman request for each of these routes. So you need to have at least 3. So these are the requests that you can run from the Postman. These should be contacting the Heroku online version of the online server, not your local one, and just to send the request and get some response back. Okay, and then we come to the last part, and the last part is mostly about changes in the front end, and there's not that much. So the first one is to fetch all the lesson information with a get, and I think we already did that in the group work. And then the second one is a fetch request, which saves new orders with the post after an submit order, or after the order is submitted. So that's essentially calling this one. And because this is a post request, the fetch is slightly different, and which we're going to cover in the lecture this week. So you need to send, actually this specifies a post request, and also you need to including the data that you want to save as well. And finally, fetch request, which update the number of spaces, class space, after an order is submitted. So that's essentially using or calling this route or REST API. Again, that will be covered this week. And it's actually very similar to the post part. You just say this is my put, and you then set what changes you want to make to the particular JSON record. And okay, that's all in terms of the information regarding the coursework too. Any more questions or? Okay.
Nothing for me.
Let me stop the recording. I think